Okay, so it's lovely to have you with us, Robbie. Congratulations, I've heard you've just recently had a paper published. Can you tell me what the title of the paper is?
Yeah, thanks so much, Luke. It's great to be chatting to you. So the title of the paper is Touching Through the Puzzle of Mediated Contact, and this is something I wrote with Dr. Will Hornet, who's at the University of Cambridge.
Okay, so before we get into the kind of the puzzle and what it means, whether it's important, how we're to make sense of touching through, can you say a little bit about how you even came to write this paper in the first place? Because I know it was co-authored, so do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, my co-author Will Hornet and I both did our PhDs at the University of Sheffield, and we were both in the postgrad room of Victoria Street, where the old philosophy department was. And I remember we were sat next to each other, and for a previous paper that I was writing, I was reading the Sexual Offences Act. And there's a bit of the Sexual Offences Act, section 79, that has this kind of odd paragraph where it says touching includes touching with any part of the body, with anything else, through anything, which is kind of important because there'll be certain sexual offences that do occur, for example, through clothing. I remember Will sitting next to me happened to glance at my screen, not sure if he saw any of the context, but he just saw that phrase, touching through anything. And he said, that can't be right. You can't touch someone through anything. Like, I couldn't touch you through a wall, for example. And then we just started kind of talking about this, especially at the pub. It led to a lot of pub conversations, really completely abstracted from the initial legislative context. Just thinking of this puzzle as, yeah, when can you touch someone through something? Clearly, people touch each other through their clothes all the time. And we describe that as one person is touching another through their clothes, but there's then many other things that you can't touch someone through. I mean, his example of walls is a good one. And we had lots of conversations about this, trying to work it out as a bit of a kind of fun philosophical puzzle. And then at some point we realized, no, actually there is a serious philosophical problem here that also has important moral and maybe political implications. So at a certain point we just said, right, let's try and turn this into something and see if it's got legs.
Okay, so another example of sort of philosophy coming out of pub conversation, basically, which is good. If you're listening, any funders, please fund more of this. But I guess the interesting thing then is to try and work out sort of what this puzzle is, what the serious puzzle is here, right? So it sounds like you were sort of starting off trying to interpret a piece of legislation, obviously that's written in quite an open way on purpose. The kind of philosophical pedantry gets going, and we sort of think, okay, there's certain things that don't seem to apply. Can you state the puzzle a little bit more precisely and kind of help us understand what it is and why we should be worrying about it?
So the puzzle is, what does it mean to touch someone through something? Or to put it more formally, under what conditions can one person touch another person through something? So to give a couple of examples, we can touch someone through a shirt. If you pat a friend on the back, they've got a shirt on, you're clearly touching that person. And that's important in a few different ways. So one positively is, touch is a way that we express all kinds of attitudes. It's how we show affection and empathy and support and congratulation. And so it kind of matters to us as social animals that we know when we are showing those kinds of attitudes and when we aren't. More negatively, it also comes up in kind of criminal cases, moral wrongs. So that explains the root of the legislation we were looking at, where it matters for courts whether someone has touched someone through something, because certain crimes require there to be touch, and sometimes we want to make sense of whether that touch has occurred through, for example, clothing. So some things you can clearly touch people through, some things you clearly can't touch people through, like a wall, but then there are going to be some tricky cases, like can you touch someone through a very thick coat or 3 very thick coats? And so there's this kind of puzzle about what it means to touch someone through something and when a person can be said to touch another person.
Okay, and so when you started investigating this, did you hope to resolve this in a kind of straightforward and simple way? Was it possible to do that?
So at first we thought it might be a puzzle without a solution, and we'd be kind of okay with just raising the puzzle. But the more we thought about it, the more we came up with what we think might be a promising solution to it. So as part of that solution, we distinguish between 2 different kinds of boundaries. So first we think, well, what's direct touch? forget about touching through for a moment. What does it mean to touch someone? Well, usually that means the surfaces of two people's bodies come into contact. So it's skin on skin. We might think of the skin as the physical boundary of a person. Now, clearly with touching through, that can't be how it works. What makes it touching through is there's something in the way, that by touching something else, you are touching the person themselves. So first, we kind of developed this idea from the work of Talia May Becher of a material boundary. So a material boundary is something that is an obstacle to a person's body. If someone's wearing a shirt, that's a material boundary of theirs. It stands in the way of seeing or touching that person's body directly. But there's also other kinds of boundaries that we might think of as personal boundaries. So if someone gets too close to you, in your personal space, it's not that there's kind of an obstacle to them touching you that they're up against. There's just air there, but there's still a sense in which they've invaded something or they've crossed a boundary. And so from that, we again from Talia May Becher's work, developed the idea of a moral boundary or a personal boundary. And a personal boundary is something that if someone touches it, it expresses a certain kind of closeness or a certain kind of intimacy. And that might be a kind of transgression. There might be a wrong done there. So sometimes a person might wrong someone by touching them in a way that suggests it's the kind of touch that would often be reserved for people who are close, but it's not consensual, so it's a violation. So you've got material boundaries and moral boundaries, and we think one person touches another through something when they touch something that is both a material boundary and a moral boundary. So what might that look like? So again, I've got a shirt on. That's a material boundary of mine. It's blocking visual access to my body. Someone can't see me or touch my body because I'm wearing this shirt. But it's also a moral boundary, a personal boundary, because if someone came up and touched my shirt, they would be expressing a certain kind of closeness to me that I may or may not be okay with. Okay. So why does someone touch me when they touch my shirt? Because while I'm wearing it, my shirt is a material boundary and a moral boundary of me.
Okay. So this may seem like a kind of a silly question then, but someone might say, well, why don't we just talk about touching you when you're wearing the shirt, right? Like ordinary language, we sort of say, oh, you touch me, don't touch me. We don't have this additional step where we're sort of trying to figure out sort of if the touch occurred because we're wearing clothing. Is that a mistake of ours? Like, is it sort of materially important that there is this sort of intervening layer because of the more problematic cases, or, do the critics have something there?
So we think that's quite right. So one thing we note in the paper is that in our everyday language, we might know that there's this distinction between touching directly and touching through, but then we put it to one side. And we see that in legislation, for example, where they say, look, touching obviously includes touching through. We acknowledge that there is this phenomenon here, but then we put it to one side, which suggests that in our everyday language, I think, that we kind of don't make a distinction, and importantly, that we recognize touching through as literally a kind of touch. So here's kind of, I guess, then why we think the project is still important. First, it's just there is this kind of interesting, weird quirk of our language. That's a kind of weird thing that by touching my shirt, something that is not me, someone in doing that can touch me as well. That's kind of weird. That seems almost like magic. How can someone touch me by touching something that is not me? So we wanted to uncover that puzzle. And we also think that there will be tricky cases. So I talked before about multiple layers of clothing, how thick something has to be for you to touch someone through. That might be genuinely indeterminate. We also found that there are historical criminal cases where actually whether there's a guilty verdict or not hangs on precisely whether someone could be said to touch someone through something or not. So in virtue of being related to the Sexual Offences Act, a lot of these cases are unfortunately quite grim. There's one we found where someone was convicted of sexual assault. This was a case in 2005, and what was reported to have happened was that the assailant grabbed the victim's tracksuit pocket and pulled the victim towards them. And the representation for the assailant, the accused, in the case was that, well, that can't be touch because the assailant wasn't placing pressure on the victim, that because they were pulling the victim towards them. And what the court said was, well, that's not required for touch. You can touch someone through their clothing by touching their clothing, even if you're not placing downward pressure on their body. And so what we think happens there is the court and the representation for the assailant were drawing on different ideas of what touching through means. So it seems like there are cases where people are going to disagree, but not only that, there are cases where this really matters, where something hangs on this, and it's desperately important that we get the answer right in a way that's going to serve the interests of people who've been wronged. So
I remember talking to you years ago, I think, about an early version of this. You gave a talk about it, and we had one of those discussions that started off innocently enough and went on for ages. And I think at the time I remember having these examples of kingly garments and brides and things. So cases where someone might be wearing a very long wedding train, or they might have a kind of, the king might be getting, taken to a state event with a very long robe on, and someone touches the end of the robe, perhaps even by accident. And these are cases where, they're kind of causally connected to the person, but they might have a defense that they didn't touch the king, or they didn't touch the bride, they touched the dress. And that might also be a case where there's a kind of moral boundary being breached because maybe getting close to the king or close to the bride is kind of socially significant. So what are we to make of these cases? I mean, there's sort of cases that quite literally put the person, doing the thing at quite some physical remove from the other person, right? But the clothing is kind of mediating. So on your account, what are we to make of that?
Yeah, so there's, I think, two things that we might say in this case. The first is that if there's a worry about there being a counterexample here, we can avoid it. So take the case of the king with the long robe and someone touches the end of that long robe. We might think, well, that's not really touch, but will our account count it as touching through? Is that going to be a problem for our account? I think we can say no for two reasons. On the one hand, it's not clear that the end of that cloak is really a material boundary of the king. It's so far away from him that that's not an obstacle to seeing or touching the king. And on the other hand, even if it looks like there's a moral boundary because, in a sense, the person touching the king has transgressed some social norm, they've done something they weren't supposed to do by touching this thing of the king's, it's not the kind of boundary that suggests a sort of closeness with the king, perhaps, just given how far away they are from the king in touching the end of the robe. So one thing we can say is just, we would say in that case, that is not touching the king through the robe. There might be cases where this looks trickier, though. So it seems plausible that if the bride is coming down the aisle and someone kind of jumps out and starts touching the end of their trail, that there is a kind of violation there. They're doing something wrong, and that might not be something like interrupting the special day. It could be that there's a kind of imposition on the person of the bride themselves. So what we say about these tricky cases is this: on one hand, is the dress or the train a material boundary of the bride? Well, plausibly, it's something that's acting as an obstacle to the bride's body. You can't see the bride's body because she's covered in the dress. And then the second question is, well, is it a moral boundary? Does doing that convey a certain kind of unwarranted closeness to this person? And then plausibly we might think it does. That touching this person's garment in that kind of way is an imposition that's wrong precisely because it does convey a certain closeness or crosses a certain kind of boundary of the bride. So I say it's sort of indeterminate, and we might worry there that our account just kind of leaves this stuff open. And we think it does, but we think that's not a problem. So what we say is, well, what our view on touching through is giving is a way to work through the puzzle. So it gives us a set of questions to ask, one of which is, well, do the relevant social norms say that touching the train of a bride's dress expresses a certain kind of intimacy or closeness to the bride? And that's ultimately going to be cultural. And as with any kind of cultural norms, there might not be a fixed answer to that. So in some cases, that's going to be relative between different cultures. In some cases, we just have to kind of work out what the norms are, what the culture is, and that requires us to sort of go and do some sociology and maybe some empirical work to find out. So there are some cases that are going to be tricky, but we think we can explain at least why they are tricky cases.
Okay, so we've been focusing on kind of examples that concern clothing, your shirt, the king's robe. We might think that there are other cases where it looks like the boundary is material, but it's not a boundary of clothing. It's also one that looks kind of culturally significant. So take an example of a car, right? Someone's sitting in their car and they're absentmindedly touching the window. They've got their hand against the window, maybe on the phone or something, and someone walks past in the street and then also puts their hand out and touches the window from the outside, as if they're sort of high-fiving this person. Your account, a critic would suggest that's touching through, right? And I'm wondering whether this is a problem. And we might worry this is a problem because we might worry we're trying to work out what the stranger has kind of done. The stranger might agree that they touched the vehicle, and there might be reasons to think that's inappropriate or problematic to touch someone's property without permission. But they might strongly disagree that they touched the person inside, and they might say, well, I never intended to touch them. Of course I didn't touch them. I touched the window. What does your account make of these kind of cases? And is it a problem for the account that they do seem to be potential counterexamples?
Good, so we think it's not a counterexample. So in this case, there's an initial problem, right? So a driver's in their car, one person comes up and touches the car, they're touching a material boundary of the driver, it's something that is obscuring the driver in a certain way, and it looks like they're touching a moral or personal boundary. If you touch someone's car, it at least usually indicates a certain kind of familiarity with them. So the way that we deal with these kinds of counterexamples is to add in a little proviso in our view of what touching through is. So we say it's not enough for touching through that the thing that a person touches is both a material boundary and a moral boundary of that person. We say that in some sense it has to be a moral boundary in virtue of being a material boundary. So let's look at what that might look like. While I'm wearing my shirt, it's clearly a material boundary of mine, and by touching it, someone crosses a moral boundary. And the reason that they cross a moral boundary, the reason they cross a personal boundary of mine is because I'm wearing it. They indicate a certain kind of closeness to me because they're touching something that is so spatially close to me. There are other cases where it looks like these conditions are met, but not in the right kind of way. So if my shirt is on my washing line, and they kind of come and touch it, maybe they've crossed a moral boundary, a personal boundary of mine by touching my possessions, but it's not something that is at the same time a material boundary. So it's not, in that case, it wouldn't be touching through. So how does that work in the car case? Well, we say, yeah, it looks like they're touching something that's a material boundary and a moral boundary of that person, the car, but we think the fact that it's a moral boundary has nothing to do with the fact that it's a material boundary, that it's between the two people. And I think we can see that by imagining if the driver wasn't in the car and someone came up and touched their car, it would still feel as though a personal boundary has been crossed, because touching a person's personal property like that does suggest a certain kind of closeness to them. So it's true that when the driver's in the car and someone comes up and touches it, it looks like they meet the conditions of, yep, they've touched a material boundary of the person and a moral boundary, but those two things aren't connected in the right kind of way. It's got to be that to touch someone through something, you have to touch something that is acting as a boundary of that person and thereby cross a person's personal boundaries, but cross a personal boundary that has to do with the fact that it's kind of close to their body, that it's acting as a material boundary.
Okay, so here's another example, and you can maybe use this to explain why I've not understood the theory correctly. So I was just imagining, I don't know, imagine a council's built a playground and there's a trampoline in the playground, and someone's sitting on the trampoline and someone else crawls underneath the trampoline and pushes up and sort of touches the trampoline from underneath. So it's a case where, you know, the person on it might be aggrieved in some way. They might feel that they've been touched by this person. The other person might say, no, I was just touching the trampoline and happened to be someone sitting on it. And guess what I'm getting at is that looks like there's a case where there's sort of a material boundary has been kind of touched in some way, but it's not clear that the trampoline is a kind of moral boundary of any kind. I mean, it doesn't belong to anyone, it's just out there. So why do we need the moral boundary condition on the account? Like, can we just do away with that?
Good. So I take it in this case, the idea is the person pushing the other person on the trampoline is like directly below them, so their hand is in very close proximity to the person. Yeah, good. So the reason that we need a moral boundary condition is that without it, we would get really weird counterexamples. So for example, if you and I are on different sides of a wall and I'm pushing on one side of the wall and you're leaning on the other, well, I'm touching what is in a sense a material boundary of yours, because were it not for that wall, I'd be touching you. So that's why we have the moral boundary case. So then to think back to the kind of trampoline idea, yeah, so the trampoline is not a person's personal boundary because of any idea of ownership or anything like that. And crucially, this works regardless of whose trampoline it is or anything like that. So in that case, the person touching the trampoline crosses the other person's moral boundary precisely because touching the trampoline in that way kind of indicates a certain kind of intimacy, or in this case involves a certain kind of forced intimacy or non-consensual intimacy, because it's moving one's body or bringing two bodies into kind of proximity in a way that would usually be reserved for intimates.
So it's the kind of moving of the body thing that makes the difference between that case and like the wall case, for example.
Yeah. Okay. In particular, it's kind of according to the kind of social or cultural norms, what would get read as being indicative of a certain kind of closeness.
Okay, so what are we then to make of, I don't know, I'm thinking of another case like the sort of indecent snooker player. So somebody comes up in the street carrying their snooker cue and they poke you with it, like in an intimate place, let's say.
Yeah.
Is that them touching you through the cue? Or is it them doing something else? I mean, again, critics are going to push at the account and sort of wonder about these kind of cases, right? So that's a kind of case where they're kind of moving a part of your body that may have, social cultural significance, and they're doing so via an object. It's not a piece of clothing. It's actually quite a long object. They're quite far away in this case. And they might sort of concede that they poked you, but they might disagree that they touched you in what they're doing. And I'm wondering, again, these cases might seem silly, but they might matter in the law. There might be important distinctions to be made here, right? So are these cases where it breaks down slightly, or do you think your account has a grip on them?
Yeah, good. So in that case, we want to say kind of normatively, thinking about the kind of moral landscape, that's also going to be a very serious violation. We have a distinction that we're thinking more about, I think, for future work, about touching through versus touching with. So we want to say in that case the snooker cue is being wielded as a tool. So one person wrongs the other because they are touching them with the snooker cue. They are bringing something else kind of into contact with that person's body. But we think in that case it's implausible to say that the two people are touching rather than one person is touching another with something. In cases of touching through, we want to say, well, no, it is genuinely that one person is touching another, that the two bodies are touching, and we think there's a helpful distinction there.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like this is kind of a really good example of how philosophy can kind of come out of nowhere and kind of grip your imagination, get you thinking, and kind of generate these puzzles that sort of go on to seem quite complex and to have implications. I guess one question I have for you is sort of, in the process of working through this, were there sort of implications or possible implications that you had, never anticipated that are actually sort of coming out of this work and that may generate future work, or maybe kind of important when sort of thinking about morality or the law, things that you think we should worry about more?
Yeah, so there's one thing that Will and I have been thinking about that's been put to us by people in kind of discussions and Q&As, which comes out of the idea that touch clearly expands beyond direct skin-to-skin contact, and that is thinking about touch, in particular non-consensual intimacy in the virtual sphere. So what we have in mind here are virtual reality platforms or forums in which someone controls an avatar who has what looks like, say, a human or humanoid body and moves through space. And one thing that can often happen in those virtual landscapes is that one person controlling an avatar might cause their virtual avatar to do something that looks like assault on another person's avatar. And when some people are reporting their experience of that, they don't just talk about it as this thing that happened in a game or to a character. It seems as though they are more distressed than that, and will sometimes use the language that we might expect of someone who's been attacked kind of physically in person in that kind of way. And one thing that we've started thinking about, or has been put to, is whether this work on touch as expanding beyond direct physical touch might also have implications for the virtual landscape. Now, clearly our account isn't going to explain touch in that kind of domain, because it won't meet the conditions in the right kind of way, but we do wonder whether the work we've done there might give us some ingredients or resources to start thinking about what's going on in this virtual domain, and how we might explain the kind of experiences, the reported experiences of people who've been through that kind of online.
Yeah, it's super interesting. It connects nicely actually with the work of kind of people like Robbie on sort of teledidonics, or the use of technology to kind of mediate sexual contact virtually, or using kind of physical tools but separated by distance. I guess I was wondering then, so like stepping back, is the bigger picture here to try and get an account of mediated contact? So we've got kind of touching through, but we've also got touching with. Are we going to try and unify these things? We're sort of talking about situations in which there's a kind of morally relevant mediated contact between people, maybe with clothing in the way, maybe with a car in the way, maybe with other tools in the way, snooker cues and so on. Is that something that you're working on, or is this just kind of a one and done, I'm happy to have it published but I don't want to go back to it situation?
We'll see. I think the moment we were just really excited by this, like one specific puzzle, there was also something that no one had really written about before. We see kind of it gets mentioned in lore and then put to one side. There's certain philosophical writing where it gets kind of acknowledged but not really investigated. So our focus was really on just bringing this particular issue of touching through to the forefront, and suggesting that there is a puzzle here, that we maybe have an answer that we're pretty convinced of, but we're really excited to see what people think and to hear about kind of why people disagree.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Luke.